I guess you guys can see my screen, and I'm really excited to be yet again on PNSQC this year. And yeah, you might have seen me in various different conferences. You can follow me on Twitter. So tweet away as I speak. If you agree with something or you have some questions, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. So let's get to the topic. Before that, I have a couple of questions for you. Have you ever been in a situation where either you or someone else in your team is really interested in getting the right wheels for the team by, proposing continuous testing and continuous API testing, but your team still is stuck at the square wheels and they're just, continuously doing UI and focusing on UI testing, and they're too busy for the actual functional testing? Have you ever been in that situation? And then kind of like disaster strikes. And then you have this whole situation where things kind of worked in dev, but did not work in the rest of the environments. And then are we even ready to go into production? Then integration starts failing. And when integration starts failing, you start thinking about, we need to talk about continuous testing. So today I'm going to talk to you about driving Postman to meet Newman. For REST, the challenges faced and the decisions made. So this entire talk is going to be on certain challenges that some of the teams that I worked with in the past had, and how Postman, with the help of Newman, made this possible. So that's the overall gist of today's talk. The agenda is, yes, I will introduce you to API testing. I do believe that there are quite a lot of people in the testing field still who haven't got much of our exposure into API testing, and I'm sure they're interested today to know more about it. And they're probably here to understand that. So we will be talking about API testing, the types of API testing. Then I'll be comparing different tools because this was done as a groundwork in order to focus on the result that we had to incorporate in our process. The challenges that we faced were the reason why we decided on the tools, and that's what we're going to discuss about. And we'll be talking about Newman, which makes continuous testing a reality. And then we'll have a quick demo on how you can use Newman with Postman. So first of all, what is API? So the term API is application programming interface. Now, this interface is a layer between the UI and the database layer. It basically is a communication. You could picture it like a set of wires talking to or making sort of any sort of communication between the two, where the UI would send details and ask the database, and the database would then throw details back to the UI so the end user gets to see it. And API is the middleman in doing this process. That's what APIs are. Now, in the past, when APIs kind of did not exist, it was a tedious process and it was annoying and upsetting and so on. When you have find issues, fixing it was terrible. But now we have the middle layer and everything kind of is incorporated there. So when we have this, why should we focus on intense UI testing? Remember the test pyramid where you would have the unit tests and the service level tests before you focus on the UI tests. So that's where API testing falls in place, because entire functionality is actually made, is kind of inside the API layer. So if you're looking at functionality testing or you're seeing if the application is dependable, we'll be focusing on API testing. Also performance, because if your API doesn't respond fast, then obviously your UI or your application layer is not going to respond fast either. So your service layer needs to respond fast for that, right? If it's slow, then obviously everything is just going to fall apart. In the same way, API also has to be security tested. So we'll talk about that because the overall logic kind of lies in the API layer. So these are some of the API testing that you would want to consider for yourself, right? So one thing is that we want to do things like validation testing. For those who aren't aware of what validation testing is, this is basically making sure that the product behavior and the efficiency is basically working as expected and is ready for it to be released or ready for the end user to use the application. So for this, a lot of verifications would go on the API layer, and you wouldn't have to rely a lot on the UI front of things. Again, functionality, the overall logic, if it's in the API layer, then obviously you would be focusing on the functionality aspect of testing on the API level more than the UI level. Then we have the load testing. And the load testing is basically, as I spoke to you before, we need to make sure that the API can handle a certain amount of load, because we don't want API to be that bottleneck in terms of delaying the process. Because yeah, UI loading the pages and so on does take time. But if API is slow, like the DB, when the requests are made to the DB and the responses are sent back, if that is not giving you the right results at the right time, you're going to have a lot of delays afterwards. Then we also have runtime error detection. So this is basically comparing like universal results of the API code base, and this basically focus on one of these aspects, like maybe monitoring or like execution errors, resource leaks, or error detection. So these are things that you would focus on. UI testing also would be covered because you want to validate that you see the right results on the front end. Like, for example, you're searching for something and you have a search API. The API shows the responses in the specific sort order and weightages and so on. And then you just have to make sure that you see that in the front end. So to validate your the UI, you would use API testing as well. There's also security testing that you would want to focus on. So that is basically like additional steps such as like validating the encryption methodology, also making sure that like in terms of access or like right user management and so on, you could see if certain users with certain privileges can see certain results, and that kind of can be incorporated in the API level rather than looking at the UI level itself. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. There's also penetration testing. This would require you to have some advanced level tools. This is basically not sticking to the acceptance criteria and so on, but basically assessing like a threat vector in the outside perspective of things. Can I access the function in which this API has been written, resources or like processors or any sort of components related to API? And then we have fuzz testing. This is like a massive amount of data being thrown upon the API in a high extensive manner, and then checking if the API can handle it. It's like checking for the worst case scenario on how much your application or basically your service can handle. If your service can handle it, then your application will be able to handle it as well. So we've spoken about like the basics of like API testing and so on. So what was the problem that we were trying to solve? We were trying to find a tool that works for the team, and there were certain constraints that we had to keep in mind. One thing was that our team had the restriction of not everyone having the high knowledge of coding. So they didn't, some of them had various different different languages they knew, but there was also some teams, some specific people did not have the right coding skills. So we wanted to have one single stop shop tool which kind of helps with that, and it doesn't put a certain set of test engineers into that point where then I can't really involve in this. So that was one thing that we had to look for, as well as there was a lot of need in terms of like the authentication proxies and authentication methods. There's one team that really needed to use something called a MOS proxy, which is very vital because there was different services. One required different proxy setting and the other required another. So the data creation for the test was done in service A, and then service B required the rest of the data creation. So that was a challenge, as well as some teams needed to work with auths, tokens, and AWS signatures as well. We were also looking for a tool that where we can share the scripts. Now you would wonder, is there even a tool that you can't share scripts? Well, there is apparently, and we'll talk about that shortly. We also wanted to incorporate continuous testing. So we again wanted a tool that can make this happen without using things like Rest Assured or Axios or Supertest or something of that sort. Depending on what languages that you know, you would use one of these. But we wanted something that kind of makes it a reality without that coding skills required. So this is like not based on any specific organization that I worked in or I'm working currently. This is a compilation of so whatever I'm discussing is like a compilation of what worked well for various different teams that I worked before. So these are some of the tools that we compared, and a few of them kind of stood up. So there were other tools as well, but I just want to specify these tools based on those criteria, how we compared all three of these tools and which stood out and why and so on. So PAW is a pretty popular tool, especially would know that most of the developers who are interested, working in API testing, API development would use PAW a lot, but the only thing was at that time, the constraint was it was only working for Mac native, or it was a Mac native app, but currently there's beta versions for Windows and Linux. But overall, it's a very helpful, user-friendly. We'll talk about certain constraints that it had, but overall, it's a really good tool for you to do API testing, at least in manual level. Postman is one of the most popular tools. I think it's been there for more than about 5 to 6, 7 years. I don't know. And it's been evolving so much. There's a lot of contribution. As you can see, there's 5 million developers contributing to it, and used as well by many developers and testers, and it works with GraphQL. There's so much of features. We'll talk about it soon. Then there's Insomnia. So this is kind of a relatively new tool, and it's one of my personal favorites. I find it really promising, and you can create plugins for it and so on, which was something that we looked at. We had a plugin that was created for iMauth proxy, which is awesome. It was really straightforward. You didn't have to have a proxy running, just had to mention the API keys and so on in that particular, when you have the plugin in the tool itself. But unfortunately, it doesn't work for continuous testing, and it doesn't have certain testing needs, and you can't share scripts. So this is that culprit. You can't share your scripts after creating them, or save them. So that was kind of a pain, but I am really hopeful for this tool in the future. So these were some of the main things that we looked at. And in terms of authentication, I think all three tools kind of had a win, except for JW tokens were not kind of directly something that was possible with Postman or Insomnia, but then you have workarounds. Same with PAW as well, with NTLM as well. In terms of environment and specifying variables, I think all three were completely similar, or slightly different, but kind of served the purpose. So there was no sort of issues there. In terms of assertions, Postman stood out because that's the only place where you could create assertions. So that kind of fell in place in terms of thinking about automation testing, which led to continuous testing. And we were able to save responses. Again, Postman was able to do that. I think you could create some plugins with Insomnia and PAW if you have the time to invest, but that was something that we did not explore because we had that option in Postman directly. Plugins, you cannot, create your own plugins for Postman, where you can for the other two. So that's why I suggest that if you do want to, you could explore that as well. And GraphQL, we needed it. Most of the teams needed it. So that worked again well with Postman. So that's why we went with Postman. And moreover, we're looking at continuous testing, right? So we wanted something that makes it possible. And when you have a solution with a shell script, it makes it possible. And that's where Mr. Newman comes into place, where Newman made it really possible because it's a command line collection runner for Postman. I don't think many people speak about Newman. It's not super popular as Postman has become, but it is pretty similar to Postman, as in you write your scripts in Postman, and then when you want to execute it, you would have different options on Postman. Newman makes it possible. So how do we get started? Make sure that you install Node.js, and then once you install Node.js, you would install your Newman, basically npm install globally. So if you are going to do this in a continuous integration environment or cloud environment, make sure that it's installed globally. And then you would do a Newman run for the collection. If you're going to use the environment JSON as well, you could use it. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But you would specify that file, and you need to have it in a specific location, or you could use a URL. If it's like in the Postman cloud, you could use that as well. So simple as that. So these are some of the very important flags that I think was really helpful in terms of customizing that scripts. So you would write your scripts and then have the collection, and you could use these commands while you run it. So there's obviously -h, which is helpful for help, and then there's -v, which is for version. But there's also like a folder, which is basically you can select a specific folder in your collection and just run it instead of running the entire thing if you're trying to troubleshoot. There's also environment variables, like I was saying, if you have different JSON files, you can either use the URL or the file. Same kind of concept when it comes to iteration data. You want to run the same call for different users or for different values. You could have iteration data. We'll take a look at a demo script of that. And then you could use global variables as well. So you could have a JSON file for that. Iteration count. So you could use iteration count and iteration data hand in hand. You could either use a -n, or instead of that, write the entire. So if you forget, you still have an option of just writing it out fully with hyphen in the middle. And that you could run it hand in hand with a -n, or the iteration count with a -d. So you have the data. So I want to run it for 5 users, and you have a list of 10 users, then it'll just pick up the 5 users from that while it runs. So it's very helpful. You also can do delay requests and timeout requests. If you want to delay, you can specify a timeout as well. And you could bail. So this is helpful. I'll show it to you in the demonstration, where bail is going to basically be the option where if you would see a failure, you just stop the test. You don't want to run it anymore. You could have a situation that way as well. Depends on that. So you could configure it in the way you need. There's also insecure -k, which we had to use because we had some strict SSL due to the proxy usage and so on that we had to skip and use it. So therefore we were using that. You would also want to use suppress exit code. So that's basically running the test even after a failure, but exiting with code 0. So it just at the end of it, it'll anyway say it failed. So that would really be helpful, especially when you're doing a nightly build and so on. So these are some of the quick tips. We spoke about -n. So the command would be, if you want to run it for 5 iterations, you would just say -n and 5 at the end of the command, as you see here. And also, if you do want to run it for different data, you would either use JSON file like I've shown here, or you could run using the CSV file like I've shown at the bottom there. So it depends on what you prefer. And also you could use the reporter and basically specify the file name. And as you can see, that command, you would obviously do the Newman run collection.json, and then you would do the reporter CLI and specify the output file. You could specify any location if you want as well. If you want to upload a file, so Newman lets that happen as well. Just make sure that when you write your scripts, the variables that you use basically specifies the relative location of that file, and you should be good. So that's basically, the tips and tricks of how, working with Newman and how it's pretty straightforward. So let's quickly take a look at a quick demonstration. Okay, so I'm actually using typicode here. So this is a JSON placeholder, typicode.com. For those who are working with API testing for the first time, this will be really helpful. So you could learn API testing as well. And here you could see, all the requests are there, and you could even see what the expected response is going to be, so that you can assert it as well when you use Postman or even any other tool for that matter. So I've actually created a collection. You can see I've also created test environment variables. You could create that as well. So that'll be a separate JSON file. And in this new collection that I've created, this is how I created it. It's just clicking on that plus button. You could add requests, add folders, duplicate, and so on. So if you see into this request as I go, you could see that I have mentioned header and body values, and based on the document that we just saw, and assertions. So the test section is where you have assertions. Now you would be I'm not sure about the syntax. There's a lot of snippets out there, and you can use one of them and then just improvise based on that. So it's not difficult. There's a lot of documentation if you want to, but the snippets are pretty helpful, so you could use them. So I've already put those snippets in, then I've improvised based on my responses. You can look at the same. I've done it for the post request, get, and put requests. So now what I do is I'm going to export this. So this is important. So even though you run it on Postman, doesn't mean that you can run it on Newman. You have to have the collection JSON exported and stored in the location that you would want to run it from, or you need to have it in the URL and you run it. So now I'm in my terminal and I'm going to run the installation for Newman. So you would see that it would run faster than expected because I already have Newman installed, and that's probably why, but it would take a bit of time. So make sure before this that you have Node.js installed in your machine, which that step I haven't covered here. Once that is complete, now I do have to run my JSON file or my collection. So it didn't run because I stored it in my documents folder, and that's exactly why it did not run. So I will go to the right location and then just run Newman, and you can see that 3 requests with the respective assertions. So 7 assertions, as you can see, based on each of the requests. So a get has 3 assertions that I put in, as you can see here, and post and put have 2. Respectively. So that's exactly why you see 7 assertions and 1 iteration. Now I'm going to do for 10 iterations. That's why I'm using a -n. So what it's going to do is basically going to run it 10 times, which means 30 requests and 30 test scripts, and 7 assertions into 10 is 70. So that's exactly why you would see that. You see all the responses in that, you see the assertions, and then you also see the code and the time taken. So each request, you kind of can also see how much time it's taken, kind of similar to what we would see directly on the Postman GUI as well. So now I'm going to make this fail in purposely so that we can look at the bail option. So let me make sure. So every time you do a change, you need to export the file when you want to run it in Newman. You don't have to do that with Postman, so it's kind of automatically saved. But yeah, when you want to run it in Newman, you will have to export it because you need the JSON file. Now, this is where you could see in run collections, we have iterations, delays, and all those options where you can save responses and so on. So I kind of made it fail so you can see it in Postman itself. So that's what I'm trying to say. Whatever we do in Postman, we can do it using Newman. So here I ran the entire particular run, and then you could see that it kind of failed because I used bail, right? And sorry, I am going to use bail, and it's going to only run once with just the one test, and then it's just going to fail there, and then it's going to stop there without going through the entire request, right? All the setup requests. So yeah, even though there were 7 assertions, it failed. It only did 1 and it failed. So that's why you could see the first one where here it only ran for 2 requests. So that's basically the overall idea. So you can basically make use of all these configuration flags and build the perfect Newman script, or basically script it in Postman and then make it run with Newman. So once we have this running in Newman, continuous testing is pretty simple. So how is it simple? So first of all, I just want to give you an idea. I'll be just showing you like a quick script with Jenkins. And here, what Jenkins is in terms of, for those who don't kind of aren't aware of it, it's one of the most popular open source continuous integration tools, which helps with like building and continuous testing and deployment and so on. And for our benefit, it works with Newman because it's not only like Maven friendly, but like Node.js and so on as well works well with it. So therefore, it kind of is really helpful in terms of working with Newman and various other tools. So this is like the entire list of like, from code commit to scanning and testing. It works with all sorts of like even AI, like security applications and so on. So it kind of is like a one-stop shop for, especially for those of you who are interested in learning more in terms of continuous testing. And today we're talking about continuous API testing. So it's pretty simple. You would go into Jenkins and you would create a freestyle project. And yeah, you make sure that you have the Node.js plugin and all set up. You can definitely take a look at that as well before, making the Jenkins project work with Node.js related requests. And then you would then run a execute shell command to run your test. This is pretty straightforward. You just do whatever we just ran, Newman run, make sure the collection is the right location, on it's in the right location or the right name is provided, and then you say suppress exit code 1 if you want to basically avoid even though it kind of like fails, you want to go ahead with that. So that's how straightforward it is, and that is how simple and making it really possible. So that's how straightforward it is. And finally, I was talking about this problem that we were trying to solve in terms of working with mauth proxies, and we had a situation where the test data was created by a different service which required a different proxy, and proxy service, and the other application required a different proxy setup because different API keys and so on. So this is a script. I haven't kind of put the entire script here. This is basically a skeleton of the script where initially we were calling the mauth proxy, and this is all in like the shell script, right? You could basically, as you can see, I have named it as test.sh, so it was like a bash script where we call the mauth proxy, and then yes, because it's just calling the proxy, you need to set up the particular ports for HTTP or HTTPS. You would do this in Postman directly. There's an option for that in the settings, but if you're going to do it out of Newman, this is how you would go about with that. And then you would call the Newman, and you could see that entire long line there, line number 5. That's because of the entire path. And we're using an environment as well. That's what I was talking about. You could, use -e for the environment, and then you had to use insecure because we were, working with strict SSL configurations, and we needed to skip that. And then finally, we were, using the pclear command so that the entire proxy on the top gets flushed away, and then we have the next proxy set up, and then the next script runs. So by that time, the first script has already done the data creation, and that was very helpful. So having it in a shell script format, and because Newman is a command line collection runner, it was very easy to make it really possible. And therefore, obviously you need to know a bit of bash and so on, but the team didn't have to go through massive coding exercises and so on. I'm talking about the certain test engineers who required those skills. It wasn't much of a challenge, so that was really helpful. And what I finally want to say is Newman made continuous testing, API testing, a reality for some of the teams that I worked before, and I hope this would also be helpful for you. Thank you for being here and being part of this session. I hope it was helpful for you. These are the references that I've used, so you can use them as well and learn more about it. I know it was just like about 30 minutes presentation. There's a lot more that you would need to know. So these are some of the locations that you can go. And yes, I can take questions now.
Thanks, Christina. That was a really good talk. I love the meme. And I'm just waiting to see if we have any questions roll in. Your timing is just perfect. So
thank you.
Yeah, and for those of you watching, if you did, don't forget to fill out the speaker survey. That way, if you really love Christina, you can let us know that you want her back next year. So anyway, I'm not seeing any questions come in immediately. But I would encourage you all, if you want to chat more about this, we do have, I posted it in our chat room. There is a virtual coffee chat area where you can get together and talk about this sort of stuff. So we have some questions. How do you manage test scripts that aren't in the snippets section?
Yeah, very good question. That has actually happened before. So when it's not there and you really need to, I think when it comes to things like schema, JSON schema validation, I don't think the snippet really helped us with that. And there was a lot of detail in the Postman blog, and that really kind of helped us build those things. So I would really encourage you to take a look at that, because there's a lot of information there. There was also certain, basically some sort of tutorials that I also took a look at in terms of these JSON schema validation that was in test project blog as well. That was helpful for us as well. So, and there's a LinkedIn course if you're interested. So that was also helpful.
Hopefully that answered your question, Sean. Oh, also, how do you organize the different types of tests that you mentioned, validation versus load, et cetera?
Right, that's a good question. So you could actually use the same collections based on, if you want to specifically go into that. Like, for example, in terms of like security, that kind of falls into like access management, and in terms of like authorization and stuff. So what we did was we kind of segregated it in different like folders and kind of specified it. So if we do a regression, it kind of fell in one collection itself. But there was certain cases where we wanted to have like, quick tests, especially in terms of validation. So we kind of marked, so you can actually do some tagging on Postman, where you can mark it based on what sort of like, test it is. And then you could use that only when you use your collection. So that also is an option that you can use. Newman has that. I think it's -T, if I'm not wrong, based on what I recall, where you can just put in those tags and then, use that. So that was pretty helpful as well.
Any other questions? Sean says, makes sense. Thank you. You have a lot of love for your, there's a lot of love for your talk in the chat space. So sounds like we are finished. Once again, Christina. Wait a minute. One more question. Yes. Any reason why you all don't just code your API tests directly?
Right. Yeah. Good question. So that's exactly what I was talking about in terms of the challenge. So there are teams that I've worked with where we use Rest Assured, and it kind of fit the purpose, which Java Maven project. And we've had teams where I've worked with we are currently currently where we're using Axios with Mocha and Chai and stuff like that. But some of these teams that I worked with who really required the help of Postman with Newman and made API testing possible was because they had the challenge of having coding their tests because of the skill requirement in terms of knowing coding, with the others as well. So that was the main reason why this made it possible. Again, with the other factors that we considered in terms of the challenges that I listed as well. So that was one massive reason. So because of we were looking for a tool that did not require much coding skills, and that's why it's not coded. Yeah.
says, thanks. That's what I thought. We have the same issue on some teams. We have just a couple of minutes left. We've got time for probably one more question if anybody wants to ask it. I don't know if that's the one thing I'd love to see on this interface, is to know if people are typing or not. I can't tell if people are madly typing questions or not. Okay, it looks like we might be done with questions, but thank you again so much, Christina. That was a great talk.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.